Hey guys, we're coming down the final stretch. Can you feel it? Can you feel the completism of it all? Believe it or not, over the course of this semester, and I mean, we've still got a few weeks left to go, but we will have covered every single chapter in this textbook. That doesn't happen in every class. That's the Crocker experience right there. Now, what we are doing here today is, well, we're covering one of our last chapters, a very wide-ranging chapter. There's really no one way to teach this subject, so this is kind of where instructors get a little creative on their fronts. What subjects do I want to focus on when it comes to domestic policy? Well, first of all, I do take a lead from the textbook. What subjects do they cover? But on top of that, I've read a few surveys about what are the most important issues in the opinions of Americans. Now, I'll be talking about those issues according to the results of the survey. That will include talking a little bit about inflation, probably not that much, really, to be honest with you. We will talk a lot about taxation. We'll talk a little bit about climate change. We'll talk about healthcare. We'll talk about immigration, which isn't mentioned in your textbook, but should be because it's an issue that everybody really cares about. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and get this show on the road, shall we? Now, obviously, when we have a chapter on domestic policy, the number one thing we should talk about is what is domestic policy, and this is easy. There's any number of ways we can define it. Your textbook has a fine definition, but just think of it this way. Domestic policy is any issue that deals with things inside the United States. That's it. It can be things like taxes, healthcare, immigration, environment, economy, so on and so forth. Anything that deals with stuff inside the United States is domestic policy. It's that simple. If there's things that occur outside of the United States, it is dealt with foreign policy, which is chapter 14. That's why 13 and 14 are right next to each other. Now, with that in mind, there is a common thread here between chapter 13 and 14 on domestic policy and foreign policy. It's all policy, which means it has a singular policymaking process, This policymaking process is the same for domestic and foreign policy. Let's talk about it. Clearly, the first thing we need to do when it comes to policy making is figuring out what we need to care about. That's called agenda building. Now, if you listen to the Biden administration, they'll say one of the biggest problems we have, and again, I'm talking to you in the fall of 2021, one of the biggest problems we have is that there is massive benefits shown from educating our children before kindergarten, and yet we don't have a universal pre-kindergarten program here in America. If you listen to the Trump administration, one of the biggest problems that affect Americans is, the crisis at the southern border. So I don't know, what issues should we care about? Clearly, we shouldn't pick one or the other. We should work on everything as much as we can, but which issues should get priority in our public attention? That's called agenda building. Now, after that, once we decided what to focus on, we need to come up with potential solutions to the problem that we've chosen. We call this policy formulation. I think that's pretty intuitive. Nonetheless, we will formulate policies. Once we've figured out what policy makes the most sense, we will adopt the correct policy and we will put it into action. That's called policy implementation. Now, obviously, this right here, number 2 and number 3, this is largely the work of the bureaucracy and Congress. But policy number 4 is all bureaucracy, all the executive branch. We got to put this into action. And you know what? I really never appreciate, the constant insistence in American policy to put a halo over certain policies like, yay, this is a good thing for Americans, or devil horns over certain parts. That doesn't really work usually. Most of the time, most of the policy here in America does not deserve a halo or devil horns. Most of the policy here in America does not deserve a halo or devil horns. Most of the policy in America, no matter who's implementing it, has some things that work for it and some things that don't work for it. And that's what policy evaluation is all about. Figure out what the policy is doing right, and of course, very importantly, what the policy is doing wrong, so that we can make it a part of a future reform effort in the future. We can make it a part of agenda building. And so this is a little bit of a cycle. Over time, you hope the problems that you're creating, the side effects of the solutions that you're pursuing are smaller than the original problems that you're fixing. And you just hope those problems get smaller and smaller and smaller over time. But, there's no such thing as a law that does unabated good or complete and devastating evil with no exceptions. Most laws are a mixture of good ideas and bad ideas. Now, one of the most important things when we talk about domestic policy is our budget here in America. We call this fiscal policy, and fiscal policy is just a fancy way of saying budget policy. Fiscal policy is just a fancy way of saying budget policy. It concerns how we tax. It concerns how our government budgets, or more accurately these days, fails to budget. We'll talk about taxation and budgeting now for the next few minutes. And let's actually start with taxation, since that's one of the few things that affects every single person that takes this class, every single person that exists inside this country. We are all taxed. Number one. Number two, we all hate being taxed. So those things are both true. We hate taxation. Why do we even bother with taxation in the first place? Why do we even bother with it in the first place? Well, there's any number of reasons as to why. There are four that I will isolate, and they both start with all four of them start with the letter R. So we will just call it the four R's. The four R's. Now, all four of these reasons for why we tax start with the letter R, including revenue. Revenue. Now, revenue is a fancy way of meaning our government needs money to operate. It can't provide roads. It can't provide a military. It can't provide, anything. I'm just talking national there, but it can't provide, local police forces, health inspections of restaurants. It can't provide schools. Anything the government does, it needs funding. So we need revenue. Now, the government doesn't operate a business. It doesn't sell products for profit. Instead, it taxes the population to bring money in. So revenue. You don't need to know these examples, but if they help you, so be it. Okay? Everything our government does requires revenue. Now, on top of that, obviously the argument is how much revenue does it need to perform what services? Now, there is a more controversial purpose of taxation, one that we're all aware of, although we might not know that it's called repricing. We know the government reprices with taxation. Here's what we mean by repricing. It means the government uses taxation to try to change behaviors, or what I call redirect behaviors, by individuals, by businesses, sometimes by local governments. The government uses taxation to redirect behavior. This happens quite a lot. We will give you tax increases on certain behaviors that we don't want you to continue doing. What's a classic example of that? Can you think of one? Well, it's a nasty habit. Hopefully you don't smoke, but cigarette taxes is a clear example of that. Cigarette taxes, and again, you don't need to know these examples, but cigarette taxes is a clear example. We don't want you to smoke cigarettes, so we will raise the cigarette taxes if you live in any state but Missouri. Out of 51 states, including Washington, D.C., do you know where Missouri ranks in terms of our cigarette taxes? 51st. Here's how low Missouri's cigarette taxes are. If you doubled Missouri's cigarette taxes, we would still be 51st. Okay, so we have very low cigarette taxes, but that's a form. Sure enough, we have a lot of smokers here in Missouri. As you raise cigarette taxes, you'll notice that a certain percentage of voters gets smaller and smaller. Same thing with sin taxes. There's always a certain health detriments to certain products, and such as tanning beds. If you use a tanning bed, you will have to pay a little bit of an extra tax to do so. Tanning is fine normally, but if you tan too much, you can develop melanoma, which is a really expensive type of cancer to treat. So sin taxes, some people have suggested we should introduce sin taxes for soda, because we consume soda like it's oxygen in America. But soda is specifically tied to certain health defects, says the guy that drinks like 2 sodas a day. But nonetheless, perhaps we should introduce that. Maybe we shouldn't. But regardless, you can see what we mean by repricing, right? Now, repricing works both ways. You can raise taxes for certain things that you don't like. You can lower taxes or give tax credits back to certain things that we do like. For instance, if you are going to buy a home, you get a tax credit. If you're going to hire veterans, you get a tax credit. There are certain companies that will invest in alternative energy. You'll get a tax break. So any number of these things you can take advantage of. That's the government trying to prod you to do these certain things and prod you away from doing certain other things. Another reason we tax is because there's a whole class of people in our society that benefit from certain government programs, and so we have redistribution. We've talked about redistribution before, but let's revisit it real quickly. A lot of our tax dollars come out of my taxes and out of your taxes to help the less fortunate, or those who can't work because they're elderly, because they're disabled, because of any number of reasons. We have taxes to help out those particular services. And again, you don't need these examples, but if they help you remember what we're talking about. I mean, Pell Grants. Some of you are taking this class on a Pell Grant. That comes from taxation to help you pay for your education. Now, on top of that, there is a fourth reason that's more conceptual than anything else. It's called representation. You remember we declared independence because taxation without representation. Well, if we get taxed in America, we just happen to care more about what the government does with the money. So taxation is it's not the reason why we tax, but it is an effective way sometimes to get people to care about where the money goes. Matter of fact, that's a little bit of a problem, is that sometimes we institute new policies without paying for them with a tax, and Americans largely don't care. They kind of blow it off. That's kind of been a problem with the wars we've had over the course of my lifetime, is that the wars we've had in my lifetime have not been paid for with war taxes. There's a whole bunch of brand new spending that we just put on the nation's credit card. And what happens in these wars? Well, they drift on for decades because they're not at the front of our mind because it's not coming out of our pocketbooks. Now, when you look back at the 40s and World War I and World War II, there were war taxes in those instances, and those wars were a lot more aggressive and concise. They only took a few years. And of course they were devastating. But these wars these days last for decades because they just kind of drift into the back of your mind. You forget about them, and you don't have a regular tax that reminds you that, oh yeah, this particular thing is going on. So some people have suggested maybe we should bring war taxes back. I don't know if that's the answer, but nonetheless. Maybe the answer is fewer wars. I don't know how feasible those options will be in the future, but we'll see. Now, obviously, this is why we tax. Let's talk about different kinds of taxes that we have. There are several different kinds of taxes. The most common type of tax that we are familiar with is a progressive tax. And a progressive tax can look like this right here. A progressive tax is any time the money if you are making more money. Matter of fact, let me illustrate that right here. There's my phone going off. Or you're not making very much money over here. Obviously, what happens, the more money you make, the higher percentage in taxes that you pay. And I don't know what you think is appropriate. Maybe if you're really poor, you should pay 0% in taxes. Maybe if you're really wealthy, you should pay 35%, or we should pay 20%. How you want that slope to go. Do you want it to go like this? Do you want it to go gradually up? How do you think, what makes the most sense to you? And there's no clear answers here. That's a regular debate that we have in society. There's no objective answer. It kind of comes down to your policy preferences. But this is what a progressive tax looks like. And to be honest with you, they are generally popular. Most Americans are like, yeah, we have this concept called ability to pay. We think that's fair, something called ability to pay. I mean, at the end of the day, Bill Gates is paying more in taxes than I am, right? And Bill Gates is paying a lot more in taxes as a very wealthy man. But hey, he still gets to go home to his mansion. I don't pay much in my income taxes, but I still go home to like my studio apartment or wherever it is that I happen to live. So we call this ability to pay, and this is a concept of fairness. Now, generally speaking, this is a type of taxation that polls well. Most Americans like this general concept of taxation. Here's a type of taxation that everybody hates. Everybody hates the idea of regressive taxation. Regressive taxation. This is a form of taxation that nobody likes. This means the more you make, the lower percentage you pay into the system. That means this arrow essentially goes in the other direction. Now that doesn't make any sense for anybody. If I am super wealthy, I shouldn't pay less in a smaller percentage in taxes than somebody who's not super wealthy. Like, that's something that virtually nobody supports. And that's why we rarely have regressive taxes put in policy. We rarely have like, okay, we should do a regressive tax here and here. That almost never happens because people hate that idea. We do sometimes unintentionally have regressive taxes, such as cigarette taxes. Because one thing that we know is the wealthier you are, in America at least, the less likely it is that you smoke. And so these cigarette taxes largely come from who? They largely come from the middle class, and more importantly, they mostly come from the poor. So whatever it is we're funding with our cigarette taxes are largely being paid by the poor. Now, we didn't intend that with cigarette taxes, but that's the result of the policy. That's why you should always be mindful whenever the government's like, we're going to create a lottery. We're going to create a lottery and fund education using the brand new Missouri lottery that will form. Well, okay, funding education is a good thing, but who's buying lottery tickets? Not these guys. These people are buying lottery tickets. And so if you're going to say we're going to have a lottery to pay for education, that means largely it's going to be funded by the poor. Again, we're not setting it up that way. We're not like, all right, we're really going to stick it to the poor here or there. That's not what we're doing, but that is exactly what's happening with lotteries, for instance. Now, on top of that, there is so nobody really likes regressive taxation. Generally, liberals and progressives kind of like this progressive taxation idea. Liberals and progressives, they would like it to be more progressive. They would like the slope to be steeper. That's kind of what liberals and progressives kind of look like. Conservatives are largely okay with progressive taxation, but they want it to like flatten out more. Maybe not go, but instead go kind of gradually up. Conservatives want a flatter tax. Now, there are some conservatives that want a true flat tax. And a flat tax is easy enough to explain, right? Everybody pays the same percentage. So instead of sloping up like this, it's going to look flat like that. And where are you going to set this? Are you going to set it at, 25%? Everybody pays 25%. Everybody pays 15%. Maybe everybody pays 5%. I don't know what percentage you want to put at, but whatever this line is, everybody pays the same percentage. This is a different version of fair, and this comes to a more conservative idea right here, a more conservative idea of what is fair. Liberals believe that the wealthier you are, the more you should pay. That is fair because they can afford it. Conservatives say, well, it's not fair to tax everybody at different rates based on, a rich person hasn't sinned in any way just because they're rich. So as a result, we should put everybody at the same tax rate. At the end of the day, if we put everybody at 15%, the wealthy are still paying more because 15% of their wealth is more than 15% of this guy's wealth. Maybe this is what's truly fair. Now, obviously, which version of fair makes the most sense to you? Well, conservatives largely do appreciate a more flat tax. I will say that few conservatives favor a true flat tax. Most of them like progressive taxes. They just want it to be flatter. That's what most conservatives want. Because look at this. If I can bring my guy over here. All right, so look at what happens if you do adopt a true flat tax. The tax rates of the middle class go up. The tax rates of the poor go way up. Matter of fact, the poorer you are, the more your taxes are going up, right? So that and obviously the wealthier you are, the more you're getting a tax cut. So generally speaking, few conservatives want a true flat tax. Few conservatives do. Instead, conservatives want a progressive tax. Generally speaking, according to the polls, they want a progressive tax that's just flatter. It flattens out more rather than something that's more slopey. Now, there are a band of more radical conservatives and libertarians that would get rid of income tax altogether and replace it with something called a fair tax. You don't have to know what the fair tax is. You don't have to know what this is, but you may hear about the fair tax from time to time. You may hear about it from time to time, so I just want to make you aware of it. This is a radical idea. What have we said about radical before, though? It's not bad. It's just very far from the status quo. But it gets rid of all income tax and so all of this is gone, and instead, all our taxes are through sales taxes. All of our taxes are through sales taxes. So this is a pretty radical idea. Economists outside of that more radical bubble of pro-fair taxation largely don't like this idea. I don't need to get into all the reasons as to why. You're free to research it on your own, but this fair tax idea is popular with libertarians and some conservatives, but it's a more radical idea that is unlikely to become national policy. Some states do this, but nationally, no. All right, so with that in mind, we're still talking fiscal policy. We're still talking fiscal policy. Let's keep talking fiscal policy. This time, let's shift within the topic to budgeting. Let's talk about budgeting. Because governments have budgets, just like you and I have budgets, and they have to manage that budget just like you and I have to manage our budget. They have to manage their budgets just like you and I do. They have to measure the money coming in against the money going out. Right now, you and I make money at jobs, and then we spend money, usually at stores. The government doesn't go to a job every day. Instead, the government collects taxation, and then the government doesn't go to a store and buy stuff. The government invests in certain things in our society. Now, what should it invest in is obviously like the #1 conversation we are constantly having about the government. Now, these two numbers, the money that the government taxes versus the money the government spends, they are rarely the same number. One of these is usually higher than the other. They're rarely the same number. And generally speaking, if they are ever the same number, which hasn't happened for the federal government for a couple decades, if this ever happens, it's called a balanced budget. The government is bringing in and spending the same amount of money in a year. That's a balanced budget. A balanced budget is not balanced for eternity. It's balanced for that fiscal year. It's balanced for a year, okay? Now in Missouri, we have a balanced budget amendment. That means the budget has to be balanced. Otherwise, we've violated the Missouri Constitution. There are a couple problems with balanced budget amendment, but if you like balancing the budget, that is a really, really good idea. Now, obviously, balanced budgets are not the norm when it comes to the federal government. This is even rarer, a budget surplus. This is when the government brings in more money than it spends in a year. In a year, both of these are annual things. In a year, just because you have a balanced budget this year doesn't mean it'll be balanced next year. We actually, last budget surplus we had was back like 1999, 2000, several billion dollars. The government brought in several billion more dollars than it spent. And there was a big conversation. Part of the election of 2000 was all about what the government should do with the surplus. Should we pay down the debt? Should we give it back to taxpayers? Should we invest in something here or there? I don't know. What's the correct answer? Now, ultimately, what is far more common when it comes to the federal government is the budget deficit. And that's when the government spends more money than it brings in a year. The current deficit is atrocious. We'll talk about that in a second. But the government spends more money than it brings in a year. Guys, all three of these terms are annual budgeting terms. Okay, just because your budget is balanced, that doesn't mean it's balanced for eternity. Just because you have a surplus this year doesn't mean you'll have a surplus next year. Just because you have a deficit this year doesn't mean you'll have a deficit next year. These are all annual terms in a year, okay? Now, sadly, we have been running deficits for 2 decades now, with no exceptions. Now, sometimes it's a few dozen a billion. During the terrible recession of 2008 and 2009, it got up to $1.4 trillion. That's a $1.4 trillion in deficit for that 1 year. For that 1 year. Right now, our current deficit is $3 trillion. $3 trillion. That's 3,000. That's 3 million. That's 3 billion. That's 3 trillion. $3 trillion a year. A year. That's how bad the deficit is. But guys, don't confuse the budget deficit with the national debt, the total owed by the United States. Now, make sure you know the difference. The deficit is how much we add to the credit card in a year, okay? We have added $3 trillion in a year. That's how bad the budget is right now. It was 1/3 of that, it was still $1 trillion a year when Trump was president. And then the last year that Trump was president and the first year that Biden's president, it's $3 trillion a year because COVID wrecked the economy for a while. And this is the total debt. Total debt. National debt is the credit card balance. That's how much our entire country owes. Budget deficit is how much we've added to that particular credit card. And you can take a look at the credit card. There's a very useful website called US Debt Clock. Matter of fact, let's pull it up real quick. This is the US Debt Clock. This website is super ugly. So first of all, I apologize. But anyways, the thing we need to focus on is right here. The national debt we have right now is essentially $29 trillion. It's essentially $29 trillion. And that's because we have a federal budget of nearly $7 trillion, right under it. But we only have brought in $2.7 trillion less. So actually that $3 trillion figure I gave you a moment ago is not super accurate. It's instead $2.8 trillion is our deficit. That's how much is being added in the coming year to the deficit. So if we don't change that, then that 28.9 is going to be 31 here in a year, and then $34 trillion the year after that, $37 trillion the year after that. I mean, that's absolutely disgusting, right? So clearly we need to change some stuff in how we budget. For the record, you could also look at state debt. We can look at Missouri. That's Missouri right there. Missouri, its debt is crawling up. $47 billion. It's not bad to run debt like we have debt in our lives. Maybe you have credit card debt. So long as that credit card debt is not too big, there's nothing wrong with having some debt. The problem is when you get too much debt and it starts crushing you. But I don't know. Are we there yet with the federal government? Maybe. Maybe not. How exactly do we go about fixing that problem? It's not enough to balance the budget, right? Because if you balance the budget, that doesn't bring the national debt down. It just, it stops adding to it. So the question, we're going to have to run generational surpluses to fix this problem eventually. All right. So anyways, that's US Debt Clock. Let's keep on trucking here. Let's keep on trucking. And let's move on from budgeting, depressing as it is, to the very happy subject of climate change. Now, obviously, we can take some time to learn about climate change. Let me play you a quick 1.5-minute video giving you the ABCs of why climate change exists.
As a result of the Industrial Revolution that kicked off in the mid-1700s, the Earth's surface is warming up at a never-seen-before rate. A major reason for the rise in temperatures is the increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. These cause our planet to retain heat from the sun. Greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane are released into the atmosphere when fossil fuels are burned. Trees and oceans absorb carbon dioxide, but can't handle the large amounts that are now building up in the Earth's atmosphere. And because our forests are shrinking, even less carbon dioxide is absorbed. The high levels of carbon dioxide are already acidifying oceans, killing off coral reefs. It's also triggering a dangerous rise in sea levels and an increase in extreme weather events. Around the world and across Europe, innovators are now racing against the clock to invent new ways to live in our cities, use land, manufacture products, and run our businesses. New innovations are bringing down greenhouse gas emissions.
We can talk about some of that perhaps here in a bit, but that is what climate change is. The sun hits us with radiation. That radiation bounces off the Earth into space, largely not hurting us. However, the problem is that our fossil fuels are trapping that the sun's heat in our atmosphere, making the Earth unnaturally warm. Now, of course, the Earth does this over millennia. It gets warmer and colder, warmer and colder. The problem is we're seeing millennia's worth of heat increases in just a few decades, and that's because of the Industrial Revolution, and we've spewed so much carbon into the air. So what can be done about climate change? First of all, we have debated in this society as to whether it is a real problem. Good grief, it is a real problem. Let's be cognizant. Let me stand over here. Let's be cognizant of science and what the science is telling us. So what should we do about it? Well, first of all, some people, particularly the Green Party and some of the more progressive factions of the Democratic Party, they believe that we should institute a carbon tax. If companies spew carbon into the air, we will tax you. And the more carbon you spew, the more we will tax you. And that's, again, that is something that the Democratic Party as a whole, as a more progressive party, does not support, but some Democrats do. The more progressive Democrats typically do. Now, there is a more middle-of-the-road option that the Democratic Party really likes, and the Republican Party actually created, invented, but then changed their mind and drifted away from, and that's called cap and trade. Cap and trade works like this. And again, this was a Republican idea, but then the Republican Party moved away from it. The Democratic Party charged towards it. So the Democrats like this now, even though Republicans don't like it now. The problem with this, we can never get Democrats or Republicans to agree at the same time on cap and trade. But this caps how much pollution we can have in society. You can only have this much pollution in society. And what we do is we hand out hall passes to companies, and they can use those hall passes to pollute a certain amount. Now, if you need to pollute more, you can buy one of those hall passes from another company who doesn't need to pollute so much. Matter of fact, it's explained pretty well in this video right here. This is called cap and trade or emission trading.
Okay, let's do this. Today, I'm going to teach you something about carbon emissions trading. Burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, or natural gas move cars and produce electricity or heat. Unfortunately, this also generates carbon dioxide emissions, which drives climate change. The European Union has decided to reduce emissions substantially, which is where the emissions trading comes into play. The European Union fixes a carbon emissions target, then divides it into allowances. Each one allows the emission of 1 ton of CO2. These are now distributed to businesses. For every ton of emissions, a business needs to turn in 1 allowance. If it needs more or less, they can buy or sell them at a market. If it is cheaper to avoid a ton of emissions and sell an allowance, then the business will do that. But also, the business may choose to emit more and just buy an allowance from another business, if that is attractive for both parties. Businesses can face challenges, though, when competing with businesses outside of the EU, where CO2 emissions may not be subject to regulations. On the whole, the economy...
All right, so that is how cap and trade works. Much of Europe does cap and trade. We have certain states in America, like a coalition of northeastern states up in New England. They are in a cap and trade system. But generally speaking, this is a more liberal plan nowadays. It was a conservative idea at one point, but conservatives moved away from it, liberals moved towards it. And so that's kind of frustrating, is that we can't all agree on this at the same time. Instead, liberals and conservatives largely agree that we need certain amounts of new regulations. We need to invest in green energy sources. This is what Democrats with limited Republican support have passed, with an infrastructure bill that just passed a few days ago and an upcoming Build Back Better Act that's going to spend about $550 billion investing in green energy sources and trying to economically punish a little bit some companies that pollute too much. Now, this has largely been supported by liberals. Republicans and conservatives have not come around on this. Matter of fact, the message from conservatives and Republicans have been a little bit muddled as to what exactly we need to do here. But generally speaking, Republicans and conservatives have supported investing more in green energy sources. All right, now with that idea, let's move on to a tricky subject of healthcare. Here in America, healthcare is a very dicey proposition because in America, we spend more on healthcare than per person than any other Western country, and yet we get worse care. Fewer of us are treated, and the treatment that we do get isn't as expansive as it is in some of our Western neighbors. Now, what do we do here in America? We read in the chapter about the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Let's learn once and for all what it does, and let's compare it to what President Biden wanted to do and doesn't seem like he'll be able to accomplish, but we'll see, I guess, and what many of our European neighbors actually do, okay? So when it comes to healthcare, there's two major questions that we ask. The first question is, who's going to be the person providing me care? Is it going to be private doctors that work for themselves or work for a clinic and they operate for profit? Or is it going to be a doctor on the government payroll? Who's going to be providing me care? Now, there's not a ton of controversy over this. We largely agree on who should be providing us care. I mean, really, we're just arguing who should be paying the doctor. Should it be a private entity or should it be a public entity? You know, whatever. That's not a huge. The bigger conversation is here. Who pays for health care? That is a big conversation. And there is a lot of variance between many of these 5 plans over who pays for care. Now, again, that's complicated here in America because we pay a ton for health care and not everybody's covered. How do we get the price tag down? How do these other countries get the price tag down? And is that a good idea? You know, maybe, maybe not. Obviously, it depends on your opinion. Now, we currently exist in the era, since 2010, we exist in the era of Obamacare. Here's how it worked before Obamacare. We have mostly private doctors that are largely operating in private clinics, some of them operating in for-profit, and some of them operating with the government, but mostly they're operating for profit, okay? Now, who pays for that? Private insurance companies. Private insurance company, you need to have health insurance if you want many of these medical procedures, because I'll tell you this much. This knee right here that you're seeing right now, this knee tore an ACL years ago and I had to get ACL surgery. Okay, I had to get ACL surgery. Matter of fact, there is a cadaver, there is a dead guy's ACL where my ACL used to be. That's a procedure that I had 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. Anyways, this procedure without health insurance was $36,000. $36,000. I could have bought 2 cars instead of fixing my knee. $36,000. I can't afford that. So I pay an insurance company to pay for me. You pay something called a premium, which is just a payment. And an insurance company covers it for you. Now, the problem is not everybody has health insurance. Matter of fact, we have like 30 million people that are completely uncovered, or 30 to 50 million that are completely uncovered. Now, private insurance covers you unless you are poor, in which case you will have access to Medicaid, which we have actually just expanded. We'll talk about that in a second. How poor do you have to be to qualify for Medicaid? And there's Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly. So those are the 2 key exceptions here in America. Now, before we get to Obamacare, let's walk through what some of our neighbors across the pond do over in Europe. Some countries like Great Britain have socialized health care. That means that doctors work for the government. The government pays them, sets how much they charge, tells them how much they make, and the government covers all healthcare costs. Now, that's going to jack up your prices, of course. That's going to jack up your taxes. But at the end of the day, you don't pay any premiums. There are no premiums. Instead, you pay taxes. Also, everybody's covered, and that's nice. The problem, of course, is that different health insurance companies offer different health plans. And if you don't like the health plan that the government offers you, you can go jump in the lake, I guess, because there aren't any other options. Now, what's the trade-off there? What makes the most sense to you? That's up to you. But this is indisputably how it operates. Now, single payer is what many Democrats in America want. And I know I'm focusing a lot on what Democrats want because the Republican message has been kind of muddy in recent years. This was a system that Republicans worked to protect against Obamacare, which was passed entirely by Democrats. But what is a single-payer system? Canada has single-payer. Most countries in the Western world have single-payer. Well, once again, our doctors are largely operating the way that they do in our society. They're operating for profit. But instead of insurance paying their tab, the government is paying their tab. In other words, there is a single payer of all healthcare costs. Now, again, that's coming out of taxation. We are paying for it. And if you don't like the government's plans, well, then you can largely go jump in a lake. But at the end of the day, everybody's covered. And because the government controls the pricing and there's not profit that we're worried about, obviously the price can be lower for healthcare. And it is lower in most of these countries. Now, the public option is something that Joe Biden has fought for, and we will see if he is successful in passing it. I mean, my guess is he probably will not be able to accomplish this. He needs larger majorities of Democrats in Congress to accomplish this. But Joe Biden and several other Democrats want instead a public option. Once again, it doesn't really change who provides care, and instead, and it doesn't really even change who pays for the care. There is still private insurance, different private health insurances with the public option. The problem is, not the problem, but the whole gist is there is one additional insurer, and that's the government. The government offers you a health care option. So if you don't like the prices here and you don't like the options here, the government will offer you one instead. The whole idea here is that we're not forcing you to adopt the government plan now. If you don't like the government plan, there are private options you can try as well. So that's nice. And this government plan is not operating for profit like these are. So ostensibly, this could be cheaper. Now, that's all fine and good. There is some concern among people that, particularly conservatives, that this government option might be so attractive due to its low pricing and its willingness to take all comers, and that over time it could get more popular and eat up more and more of the market until turning our healthcare system into basically a single payer system. So that is some concerns that some people, particularly conservatives, have with a public option. Now, on top of that, what about Obamacare? What does Obamacare do? Well, Obamacare clearly does not change who is providing care. So you'll see that other than socialized health care, this largely stays the same, other than over here, depending on the plan that you're in. The bigger questions is who pays for care. And under Obamacare, like the public option, Obamacare keeps the private insurance intact the way that it is, except for Medicare and Medicaid. So what Obamacare does is two changes. There are two changes due to Obamacare. The first is it expands Medicaid, meaning it forces states, or at least deeply, aggressively encourages states to expand how poor you have to be to qualify for Medicaid. Prior to Obamacare, in most states, such as Missouri, you had to be dirt poor to qualify for Medicaid. Now, under Obamacare, Missouri has just recently, in 2020, expanded Medicare. I'm sorry, it's expanded Medicaid, which means now you don't even have to be at the poverty line. You could be just a little bit above the poverty line and still qualify for Medicaid. So that's number one thing that Obamacare did. Now, on top of that, it also introduced an individual mandate to try to get everybody health insurance. It says you have to get health insurance or you pay a penalty, and that penalty is essentially the price of health insurance. So one way or another, gosh darn it, you are getting health care. Now, obviously, Obamacare and the many different things, you've read about this in the text, it does many different things. These are just two of the top line things that it does. They're all largely popular, but this thing is incredibly unpopular. People don't like being told what to get, right? Here in America, they don't like that. So Republicans under President Trump tried to undo Obamacare. They were not successful in doing so, but they were successful in lowering the individual mandate to $0. So now, if you don't get health care, you are violating the individual mandate. Here, if you don't get health insurance here in America, you're violating the mandate, but you're fined for that $0. So that's where we are right now in our system. Guys, are you enjoying this conversation? Are you enjoying this conversation? Because if you are, I just want to remind you that we do offer PLS 103 here at OTC. PLS 103, it looks like me, right? Without the glasses, perhaps. But that's me. I teach a class entirely on public policy. There it is. There it is. It's over there. It's okay. So anyways, take this class because entirely what we're going to be doing is, geez Louise, sit down. Sit. Sit. You go sit. Enough. Enough of that. Bad picture. Bad picture. All right. So anyways, take this class because all we do is talk about public policy. We'll talk about domestic policy, such as the things we've already talked about, but in far more detail, or we'll talk about foreign policy, which we'll talk about a little bit in chapter 14. We'll get there. But anyways, highly recommend you take this class. Do you like me? Maybe, maybe not. I hope you do. But if you do, take this class, and I'll be happy I'll be happy to work with you. Happy to work with you. All right, now, anyways, what's the problem here? What's the problem with illegal immigration? Well, we have roughly 10 million people who are in America illegally. 10 million people, that's the population of Michigan. We have an entire Michigan here in America. We have an entire Michigan of people living among us illegally. Now, for the most part, studies confirm that these people are not danger risks, but there are any number of problems. Some of these people have entered America illegally. We've all kind of kept some loose tabs, at least, if not deeply invested tabs, on the crisis we've had at the southern border. Obviously, there are legit problems there, no matter your perspective. But about half of these people are folks that came to America illegally on worker visas, student visas, but they've overstayed their visas. They did not re-up their visa. They did not leave America. So that's what we call these people: illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants, people that do not like them. Due to any number of reasons, will derogatorily call them illegal aliens. I would encourage you not to call people aliens. This is deeply disrespectful, but nonetheless, let's talk about these immigrants. They're here illegally. Obviously, the problems are that they are coming here due to hostile home countries, many of them Central American countries that are completely dysfunctional. They are essentially ersatz dictatorships. They are run by gang violence. And if you're wondering why on earth you would leave your home to risk a Mexican desert, show up at the southern border, and potentially suffer at the hands of American Border Patrol, it's because your home country is worse. I mean, that's what people don't understand. But anyways, on top of that, we care about this for many different reasons. First of all, we care about them because of national security concerns. Largely, every study we have shows that these people showing up at the southern border are not really any more dangerous than the average American, but you could see how hostile actors could potentially take advantage of it. In addition to that, drug trafficking is a very real problem, sadly. There is a very real impact that illegal immigrants can have on work in your community, especially if you live in a smaller town where there is a larger percentage of illegal immigrants. They will work for very little money because they're off the grid. They're literally off the grid. And people who are on the grid might, demand more pay, and as a result, this can definitely affect pay, if not straight up jobs. Now, on top of that, many of them do use government services, and that's fine. These people are fleeing dangerous scenarios. We should allow, just because they came here doesn't mean their children shouldn't be educated. So they do use government services, though, and that does cost the rest of us money. So how can we deal with these people? What is the appropriate solution? Well, obviously there is no appropriate solution. There's a whole range of options. None of these is objectively the best one. It just kind of comes down to your perspective. So we have seen this with Reagan before. When Reagan was president, he allowed for amnesty, which is allowing any illegal immigrants. You can apply for legal residency, and it's what we call a path to legalization. You can do that. You have to usually jump a few hoops, or what's that phrase? Jump through a few hoops, maybe. But nonetheless, you can become a legal residency. You can also get a path to citizenship or just legalization. Citizenship means you can actually vote, but legalization means you're here as a legal immigrant, and we'll create that path for you. But you have to meet various benchmarks. You can't be guilty of violent crime. You have to pay a number of fees. You may need a year or two of college education. You may need a year or two of military service. We can figure out these specifics later. In addition to that, we have actions by President Obama. President Obama attempted to allow many of these people to stay. If you were brought here as a child by your parents, you should not be forced to leave. You have grown up here in America. You are an American in every way, but on paper, so was the phrasing that President Obama used. Now, on top of that, maybe deportations are very common from every single administration. Who are we deporting? Do we deport everybody? Is it feasible to deport everybody? Very few people have argued that it is feasible. This is probably not feasible to deport an entire Michigan out of America, especially considering the number of people that still approach us at the southern border. But deportation for certain percentages of this population certainly makes a lot of sense. One thing you could always try is to deter. We've seen this with every single president. At least in my lifetime, they have tried to deter immigrants from coming to America at the southern border. We've tried to do this in any number of ways. The Trump administration tried to be really, really tough with them, such as remain in Mexico. So if you're waiting to be admitted into America or waiting for a hearing to have a chance to be admitted, we're going to force you to wait in the Mexican desert on the other side of certain barriers. Obviously, President Trump attempted to and failed to build a wall on the southern border. That's very difficult. The amount of infrastructure needed for that is billions and billions and billions of dollars that Congress never gave him and that Americans largely opposed anyways. There's an extremely controversial policy of the Trump administration that separated families. I think pretty much all of us think that's a terrible idea. No matter what these sins these people have committed, they shouldn't have their families broken up by the American government. Last but not least, maybe one of the reasons why people are coming here is because the country's immigration system is horrific, and so it's really, really difficult to legally come to America. So maybe we need to reform legal immigration so there's less of a bottleneck and fewer people trying to come here illegally because the legal options simply don't exist. Maybe asylum makes sense. Do you want to do asylum for 10 million people? I don't know exactly how that would work. I don't know if that's a good idea, but nonetheless, that's something you could consider. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. We have an entire semester on these conversations in PLS 103. So please join me for that. I'd love to have you. I'd love to have you. In the meantime, thank you for sitting through this conversation, and I look forward to doing it one last time. Oh, you're going to miss me. You know you're going to miss me. You know you're going to miss me. Chapter 14 coming up.